To this day, I remember thinking, wow, I made somebody's job better. This is really cool stuff. And that's still what drives me.
Welcome to HFIG Talks, a podcast produced by the Human Factors Interest Group at the University of Toronto. HFIG is the student chapter of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society at U of T and consists of students, faculty, and local professionals who are interested in the field of human factors. My name is Brianna, and today my co-host Cameron and I will be interviewing our guest, Dr. Boehm-Davis, about her career in human factors. All right, thank you again, Dr. Boehm-Davis, for joining us today. And if we could just start off by you introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background in human factors.
Sure. So I'm Debbie Boehm-Davis, and I started my career as a psychologist, did an undergraduate degree in psychology, and ended up doing some work with a faculty member who was doing cognitive psychology. So kind of assumed that would be my path. And then in my junior year, I ran into my advisor in the hall, and he said that Bell Labs was looking for summer interns in psychology. Neither of us understood why Bell Labs would want someone in psychology, but hey, a job in psychology sounded great. So I went there and ended up doing human factors work, which I had never heard of before. And that should have maybe changed my career at that point, but it didn't. I was already kind of on this path to cognitive psychology. So I continued and got a PhD in cognitive psychology, but then started looking for jobs in applied psychology or human factors when I graduated. So that was where I started. My first job out of school was at NASA doing aviation applications. Then I moved to General Electric Company, where I was doing early work on what's now considered human-computer interaction. We were studying how programmers understand software. And then I left that to go to George Mason University, where I spent 30 plus years. And then got recruited to Meta, which was known as Facebook, was actually Oculus Research when I started doing augmented and virtual reality applications at the end of my career. And I'm now, I call it semi-retired.
Interesting. So what drew you to human factors? What do you really like about it? And what made you want to stick with it?
So that first job, they sent me, I was 20 years old. They sent me on my first plane ride on my first business trip to evaluate phones that they had out in Milwaukee. And back then, Bell was the only way you could get a telephone. They were a monopoly, and all telephones went through Bell. So they had developed this new conference phone. And the conference phone was the first one to use LEDs to indicate which phone line was ringing. So if you had a conference phone and it could have multiple lines on it, then you would push the button associated with the line that was ringing. And they had just switched from the old lights, which were tungsten lights, to LEDs. And we found that when people were using the phones, anytime someone had a desk near a window, they couldn't see which line was ringing. So then we started measuring foot candles to see how bright it was. And we figured out that anytime it was brighter than a certain level, people reliably couldn't see what line was ringing. So we came back, and as I said, I was 20 years old. I thought, oh, what are they going to do with this information? Well, the engineers designed a crystal that would spread the light over a greater surface area so that people could still see which line was ringing, even in bright lighting conditions. And to this day, I remember thinking, wow, I made somebody's job better. This is really cool stuff. And that's still what drives me. All the work that I really think has been valuable has been when we've been able to make recommendations that improved somebody's ability to work with some technology or to do their job as a function of, the recommendations we've made.
That's really cool, actually. Like, I think when you find work that's like meaningful to you and you can see the change implemented, like that's the goal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So moving on to your work at NASA, that you started that on like right at your first job after your PhD, I think you said. If you could just give us a summary of your findings and the work you did there, and if there's any specific skills or principles that you carried over from aviation into any fields throughout the rest of your career.
So it's a little hard to answer that. I was at NASA 3 months when my husband was offered a job on the other coast. We were in California. He got offered a job in Washington, D.C. as a result, I'd spent those first couple months planning a research program that I was going to work on, but I really never got to execute it, at least not while I was at NASA. What happened was NASA was asked to send representatives to DC to serve as support staff for a presidential task force that had been set up. And nobody really wanted to go except me, since my husband was already there. And they were willing to send me. I mean, I looked at the other people who were sent as support staff. They'd been working 30, 40 years in the aviation industry. I had been to ground school thanks to NASA, and that's all I really knew about aviation. But I did know from my work in psychology, I knew a lot about workload and how you measure workload. And what I got assigned to was supporting the group that was looking at the cockpit displays in the new aircraft. So the issue had been that the DC-9, a version of the DC-9, had been certified as safe to fly with 2 crew members instead of the standard 3. The 757, 767 had not yet been certified by Boeing. And so the pilots were unhappy that they could see that that was likely to also get certified as a 2-crew configuration. And so they raised the flag of safety and said it's not safe to fly with 2 people. So I actually ended up as the liaison to Boeing to understand the data they were collecting on their cockpit displays and how the workload had been measured. And anyone who knows much about workload knows there's no really great measure of workload. There are a lot out there. Some of them are pretty good, but nothing is really perfect. And Boeing had, since the time of, I think, the 727, collected data on workload using lots of available metrics. And on every metric they showed, a 2-crew configuration with their new cockpit display was less workload than the old displays with 3 crew members. So there was very little question that it was, at least according to measures of workload on that dimension, it was safe to make those decisions. But what was fascinating was just watching the government's process for evaluating. So this task force there were 3 members on the official task force, and then there were about 40 of us who were support staff. We had people who were doing data analyses, like, are there more accidents with 3 versus 2 crew members? And of course, the accident rate is so low that it's hard to know. But it turns out also that there are confounds. So most planes that fly with three crew members were larger, and they flew larger distances, which meant you would fly coast to coast. Well, that meant 1 takeoff, 1 landing, whereas the smaller planes that did local routes, like up and down the East Coast, they had a lot more landings and takeoffs, and that is where more accidents happen. So you had to take all these factors into consideration, and they just did this enormous amount of data manipulation and examination behind the scenes to give to the task force members who ultimately had to make a decision about, what to do. And it was just such a great example of our government working well, where they actually used scientific data to support the conclusion that they drew.
That's great. So moving on to some of your work as the Dean of College of Humanities and Social Science at George Mason. Naturally, you would have been conducting a lot of research there, but I'm curious, were you able to apply any of these sorts of techniques to that role specifically, in addition to just teaching them and performing research on them?
I would say, yeah, I had several administrative positions, and I would say in all of them, I applied human factors principles. I mean, what information do people need? Just how do you set up an agenda for a meeting so that people have the information they need before the meeting and can think about it before you meet? When we had I actually got into a discussion at one time with a superior over a new system they were thinking about bringing in there was a finance system, and they were going to move it into the HR package as well. And the person at the meeting said, well, this is going to be this great new system. And I made a side comment to someone saying, well, if the interface is as good as it is for the finance system, it's not going to be great. And the person in charge of the meeting said, well, that's an opinion. And I went, yeah, it's an opinion based on my being a human computer interface specialist that this is a bad interface. I mean, this system, if you wanted to get financial reports for multiple years, in the year field, you had to put 99. It was like, really, this is not an intuitive system. So, trying to get some of those things changed and think about how we use our systems in the university. So yes, I do. I mean, I really think about human factors in everything I do. The most fun example was when my daughters were in elementary school, they had a fun fair every year. And so I took the job of being the map person. And what I did was I moved certain activities that had always been in a particular location to different locations, because my experience of the fun fair was that it was so noisy that parents would not want to stay throughout the fun fair. Everybody was crammed in this central corridor. And so I moved some of the things into classrooms, and they said, well, people won't go into the classrooms. And I said, I think the kids will find them wherever they are. And there was this thing called a cakewalk, where you would win a cake if you landed on the right number. And the cakes were stored in the classroom next door, but you had to go through the line to go out of the classroom where the actual event was and where the cakes were. And the lines would just block everything. So I moved it to where there was like a long stretch of classrooms that weren't being used so that the line would be there. And I put the cakes past where the line was. And at the end of the fun fair, people said, oh my God, that was like the worst fun fair. Nobody was there. It was too quiet. They made more money than they had ever made before because people stayed longer. It was quieter because they thought it was, smaller because it was quieter and more pleasant to be there. But in fact, they actually made more money.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I remember even last semester when we were being taught by Professor Chignall, like he told us a couple of things, like how we can use human factors to like improve our study area, right? And like the way light hits. And it's just like, it really can be applied to any aspect in life. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and again, as the dean, I didn't stay until they finished the building, but they were going to build a new building for our college. And so I had a lot to say about where things were and how things were laid out, and taking those principles into account to ensure that people would be able to talk with one another, but there'd be quiet time for study and all those sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. Next, we just wanted to ask if you have any previous projects that you're particularly proud of.
I would say the project that always comes to mind when I think about the one I'm most proud of is one that I did in aviation. I did a lot of aviation work over the years. After I left NASA, a colleague was a private pilot, and he and I had funding from the FAA for, 15, 20 years. So we did a lot of individual projects. This particular one was one where we were interested in taking the principles of crew resource management and creating procedures to see if procedures that captured good elements of CRM would be better in creating an environment where people use them, as opposed to the way they were currently taught, which was more as a social science kind of a thing, which is what they grew out of. And so we had two comparable fleets in the same airline, and we trained the pilots in one fleet, and we didn't train the pilots in the other fleet, except for the basics. We trained them on the old way, and then we trained the other people on the new way. And we were collecting data over a 3-year period. And what was so fun was we had pilots who were on the trained fleet who got promoted and got moved onto the untrained fleet. They started teaching their colleagues what they'd learned from us. Of course, that screwed up our experimental design, but it was such a validation that what we were doing was making a difference, and that the pilots recognized it was making a difference, and they were willing to carry it over into a place where they didn't need to do so, because we required it on the trained fleet. It was not even known about on the untrained fleet. And that was, I think, really wildly positive for me.
That's very interesting. Just as a side question, do you find that a lot where with human factors, there are a lot of things where the effect of training or other things that are a little less physical can be studied? Do you find that there are a lot of errors that come up from people training each other or not following the training or anything along those lines if there's not a physical thing to be tested?
Well, if you think about the rules of design, right? If you know there's going to be a problem, the strongest manipulation you can have is to design it out, right? So one example of this is when you put unleaded car fuel in your car, you actually cannot put a leaded fuel nozzle into a car. They made them different sizes. So the leaded fuel nozzle is, I believe, larger, and the unleaded fuel is smaller. So you can't physically put a leaded gas into a car that only takes unleaded gas. So you've designed the problem out. It just can't happen. The next is to warn people, okay, you shouldn't do this. And training is the weakest. So if you're really trying to avoid an error, especially a dangerous error, training is not the best way to do it, but sometimes it's the only thing you can do. So one of the challenges in aviation, for example, is that the FAA certifies the design of the cockpit displays. So if you want to make a change, that has to also go back to the FAA to be changed. And then it has to be changed on every aircraft. So there's a disincentive to making changes. So when you recognize there's a problem, that a display shows something that's not quite accurate, it's really a problem to go back and fix the display. You kind of wait until you do a whole redesign. So then in the meantime, your only option is training. And a lot of times training's in one ear and out the other. So in this case, where they actually found it useful and realized it and were teaching it to someone else, that's rare that I've ever seen that happen. But it is fabulous when it does, because it does mean that whatever you developed is being effective.
Interesting. I did also want to follow up on that. It seems like aviation has a lot of unique factors in terms of human factors. Are there any other fields that you found have similar sort of design constraints, like in terms of having to do things only in complete redesigns or anything like that?
I mean, I think every field has their own unique characteristics. So like in the medical field, the FDA has to approve, drugs and procedures and devices. So there are, and actually the FDA has something fairly similar, where if you are going to certify a product and it's never been done before, there's a certain set of guidelines. If your product is substantially similar to something that already existed in the marketplace before some date, then you're comparing yours against that similar device. I'm not sure that that's still the case. It was the last time I looked at the rules. So again, what you have to do in order to show that something is safe differs depending on what kind of a product it is. So I think every applied domain probably has its unique characteristics. And it's why one of the really important things is to look at the whole system, not just locally at the change you make, but the impact it has through the whole system.
Great.
Thank you. Next, can we maybe talk a little bit about your research on interruption and quality of work? If there's any like how did you conduct that research and all that type of stuff?
So there was a period of time where all of a sudden lots of people were studying interruptions. I'm not quite sure how it happened. I mean, we got interested in it, and then I realized that lots of people were doing a lot of work on interruptions. And a lot of the work was focused on the local impact. So you interrupt somebody, how long does it take them to get back on task? And what is it that drives that delay in getting back to where you were? And, that's fine. But I was thinking about the fact that if you're doing a big project, something that's not time sensitive, so if you're in aviation, a couple seconds matters. If you're writing a report at your office, does it really matter if it takes you 2.5 hours versus, 2 3/4 hours? Sure, you get some loss in productivity over time, but really, if the quality is the same, does it really matter? And so I got interested in this question of, how do interruptions affect the quality of the thing that you produce? Now, the challenge there is, how do you measure quality? It's one of those things that's not easily quantifiable. Mm-hmm. So we started looking around, and it turns out that the Educational Testing Service has the essay portion of their exam. I don't know if they still do, but they did then. And they had a scoring rubric that they would teach to people so that different scorers across the country would all score the essays in the same way. So we thought, oh, this is great. We can have people write essays. We can use their scoring rubric. So we had people do that. And then we found a couple of other domains. We looked at reading and comprehension. We looked at creativity, and we looked at things like how many uses can you think of for a brick or for whatever, and look at that. So we found kind of ways to measure the quality, and across the board in 4 different domains, as I say, writing, reading, creative tasks, and then we did a more realistic task where we had people searching a video for certain markers of danger. In all of them, interruptions affected the quality of the output. And that, to me, is far more concerning than losing a little bit of time. Because if you have students who say, oh, well, I can do this and I can interrupt, or I can listen to music, I can do these other things, they think they're producing the same quality product, but they're not. And that's quite worrisome.
I wonder, is there any like psychological explanation for that? Like maybe based off attention resources and how like if divided attention and stuff like that?
So we looked at the essays they were writing and why they weren't as good. And so we asked them to outline the essays. And we looked and we made them do a structured outline where you have like point A, and then under point A, you have, 1, 2, 3, and then you have, et cetera, et cetera. What we found was that when they got interrupted, they might have been in the middle of fleshing out an idea. And when they came back, as they were trying to reestablish what they've been working on, because of course memory fades over time. So if you interrupt someone for a minute, pretty much all of the information about what they were doing before they were interrupted is gone. So they're trying to reestablish context, and they come up at the high level, and they never go back and flesh out their ideas. And so what we were finding was that the final essays were more shallow. They weren't as deep because they had lost the thread. As they were building this argument and they got interrupted, they couldn't get back and reconstruct it. So they just came back at the high level. So we do have a theory that suggests that a lot of this has to do with, how long you've been working on something and how much memory fades. We also found, for example, we did some naturalistic observations where people got interrupted. And so there was one case where they were observing me, and I had been working on a document, and I suddenly realized I needed the reference for this one, and because I couldn't remember the date or anything. So I opened my browser, and just as I opened my browser, my phone rang. And so I answered the call, took the call, did all that stuff, hung it up. Now I remembered because I'd been working on it so long, I knew I was working on a document. So the memory for that was still active. But when I turned back to my computer, I said, I was working on a document. Why is my browser open? And so I closed the browser. I went back to the document, and then I went, oh, that's what I was doing when I got interrupted. And then I had to reopen the browser to go get the information. So that transient memory was gone, but the longer term, because I'd been working the document for so long, that was strong enough that I remembered that I'd been doing that piece. I didn't remember the most recent piece, which had faded from memory. So I think there's some consistency in understanding the memory process and how that works in terms of getting back on track.
So were there any ways that you could help to avoid all those problems, like leaving notices to yourself or so anything like that, which would help you to prevent all the negative effects of the interruptions?
There is some work that was done where people were asked to make a marker or something before they leave to answer the phone. And that sometimes works, but it doesn't actually always work. Sometimes it's just it's gone.
All right.
So best solution is no interruptions when you're working.
And obviously we can't create a no interruption environment ever. But if we know we're doing something where we really shouldn't be interrupted, we should create, just as you said, creating a better workspace with lighting and stuff, create an environment where you are less likely to get interrupted if you're working on something that you think will be negatively affected by that interruption. And if you're just working on checking emails and that sort of thing, it probably doesn't matter. But if you're writing your dissertation, you might want to have some blocks of time where you're not being interrupted constantly.
Very nice. So moving on to some of the things outside of research, we found that you had worked on a variety of books on human factors, and within those were a lot of different examples on uh, projects that various people had done within the field. Were you able to find any particular themes that would make some designs good, some designs bad, or even the design process better or worse in terms of how effective their final product would be?
I mean, I think the biggest issue that popped out for me, and this has been across my career, so I mean, it's embodied in the books, but it's when you do something locally, but you forget the entire system. So the best example of that is some work that was done by Wayne Gray, Bonnie John, and Mike Atwood at NYNEX, New England Telephone. There was a new operator workstation. So the operator, this is when you used to have to call and say, operator, I'd like to make a collect call, or operator, can you bill this to this number? So there are all these things that operators did, and they had a workstation. And the workstation was old. It was kludgy, like they had certain functions that were orange coded, and a new one came along and there was no room over there. So they put the other orange key on the other side of the keyboard, and just a lot of things about this system that were not good. So a company came in and designed a new ergonomically correct keyboard. So Wayne, Bonnie, and Mike were just developing CPM GOMS, the task analysis technique, which allows things to happen in parallel. So traditional task analysis, things, don't necessarily can't take place at the same time, but with CPM they could. So they wanted to test this new modeling technique that they were working on. So they modeled 15 different calls that you could do, and they modeled it with the existing workstation. The new one hadn't been developed yet. I mean, it was in development. And they had the specs for it, but they didn't have an actual keyboard. So they looked at the current keyboard, they laid out what people would do, and then they used their model to predict what times would be like with the new one. And it predicted that it was going to be worse. And they thought, oh, in fact, the story is funny. They told me that they were sure they had done something wrong. So they submitted the paper saying that it was going to be worse to the CHI conference. It got accepted. They figured they'd go back the next year and say what they had done wrong and fix it. Turns out they hadn't done anything wrong. The keyboard was locally optimized. So now all the orange functions were together. But when the orange functions weren't all together, it turns out that you could use the right hand to hit one orange key and the left hand to hit the other one. So you could hit them really quickly or almost in parallel. And then there were times where the operator had to type 10 digits in, and they took away all those typing. They automatically took that, I think, from voice recognition or something. So all 9 of the 10 keystrokes went away. But they used to have them type that 10th one while the customer was talking, and they moved it to a different time in the call, and it was when nothing else was happening. So that actually added time to the critical path. And it turns out that a lot of these small decisions added up to the new workstations being slower than the old ones, because they optimized the keyboard, but they didn't understand the entire task that the operators were doing, and they didn't model that correctly. And then when the new systems came in, there were studies that were done. They collected data. They were actually slower. It was a whole big thing.
So after they found out that the new system was slower, did they change it and go back to the old one, or how did they?
I don't remember actually. I do believe that the person who made the decision to buy the new ones eventually lost their job. But and there were all these complaints like, well, you must not have done the observation study correctly. And then people came in, they'd done it correctly. So a lot of hubbub around it. But I think once they purchased them, the operators loved them because they were a lot easier to use. I mean, because locally they were easier. But yeah, well, eventually all of that went away. So technology changed. We didn't have to use the operator. So
Nice. Okay, thank you. And so moving on to our next question. From when you first started in this field to now, what would you say have been the biggest changes you've seen?
I think that the only real change is the domains to which we're applying our knowledge. So, this field started in the 50s, mostly around aviation. And then, I joined the society in 1980, and the computer systems tech group. This was before people called computer systems HCI and before UX and before all that stuff, but it was human factors applied to computer systems. And that was huge. I mean, every session in a meeting had at least one session that was computer systems. Now I think healthcare is there. And then for a while it was human performance. You know, they change over time as people recognize that there's a willingness for an industry to adopt our principles and apply them in their setting. So I think that the domains have expanded, and I think there are more of them now, but what's currently, I would say, popular or making the biggest, news changes from time to time. I'm a psychologist, so I see the lens of what psychology brings to human factors. And I don't think there's anything that's changed in the time that I've been working. That is, psychology is still understanding how we process information and what constraints that places on how we can receive information. We know more about that now than we did before, but fundamentally, nothing has changed. And I've gotten frustrated at times where I've sent students off to work that was done in the 50s that I think is still, the fundamental principle still applies. And they'll say, but that wasn't done in this domain. I'm going, it doesn't matter. I mean, if we fundamentally can't process this information, we can't do it no matter what the domain is. So that part I don't think has changed. I think it's just that we're applying it in different fields than we were before.
That's very interesting. It seems like there's a lot of carryover between fields in terms of human factors. Do you think there are certain specializations that it's difficult to transfer over, or if you're good at one aspect of human factors, you probably have some degree of applicable skills across a variety of its uses?
Well, we all bring different things to the table, right? So in any domain, there has to be this combination, fundamentally, the engineering piece and the human piece. And the human piece can be at the cognitive perceptual level, or it can be at the physical level. So I have to fit in the seat, and I have to be able to reach the steering wheel in the car. And the engineers know what the constraints are from the technology side. So they have to come together. I mean, I think that's what's unique about the field, is that there is a division in the American Psychological Association called Applied Experimental and Engineering Psychology, but they only take psychologists. So they're only seeing things from that perspective. And I think that whether you're a designer or an ethnographer or a sociologist, you're all bringing a different lens to the way that people work together with technology. So all of those factors have an influence. We just put our lens on it. So we say, well, we can make it better from this perspective. And someone else will have to say what can make it better from a different one. And you hope that if you put those two together, they still work together. And that's why you'd like to have those intersections between the different fields or among multiple fields, so that you don't negate one gain in one area with a negative on another side.
Great. Now, in terms of sort of collaborating between the different fields, we know that you've been involved with the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. Was that the one that you were referring to earlier on when you mentioned the society? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. So when I joined, it was the Human Factors Society. Internationally, ergonomics is the term that's better known. And so the society incorporated that into their name. And they go by HFES, Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. They're a professional organization whose goal is to improve the scientific base from which scientists can work. They hold an annual meeting every year where you have an opportunity to meet other people who are doing work that is similar to the work that you're doing. And it provides this opportunity to get feedback that you can't necessarily get locally. So I was just telling somebody before, early in my career, you could submit an abstract to the conference and get accepted just based on an abstract. And there were times I literally was analyzing data on the plane. And when I got to the conference, I could talk about that work hot off the press and say, I have these data. I think this is what it means, but I really haven't formulated it. And then as soon as the talk was over, you could go out in the hall and talk to people and they'd say, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. And you get that experience that you can't get locally because you rarely have lots of people in the same university who have such similar interests to yours. So it's an opportunity to grow your network and get collaborative feedback. And over the years, there are people that are now, I consider friends who I met professionally, and I sometimes only see them at the meeting once a year, but it creates a home away from home. And I've done lots of volunteer things. I started as a reviewer, so reviewing papers for the annual conference. Then I was asked to stand as the chair for that technical group. And then from there, I was asked to chair the Council of Technical Groups, which is composed of all the chairs of technical groups. And eventually got asked to run for society-wide office with secretary treasurer. Then I was the president. And, since then, lots and lots of committees of different sorts. At the moment, I'm actually really excited. I'm working on the Leadership Development Committee, and we are part of the education division within HFES, and we're trying to develop materials to support people who are trying to help lead the society. So materials, there are handbooks and some materials available, but there are some things that could be stronger. There are other ways that we could provide more information to people to help them grow in the society.
So would those be the chief ways that people can get involved with either submitting abstracts or attending the general meeting and using the resources? Is there anything else that people can do to get involved with it?
So as a student, you can volunteer to be on a committee. Actually, if you search online and you search HFES org chart, it will pull up a chart that shows all the committees and the structure of the society, which most people I don't think are very much aware of. And so you can say, oh, this sounds interesting. And then, reach out and volunteer to serve as a volunteer. You can also, I know you guys have a student chapter. So having a student chapter, you get to meet at the annual meeting with other student chapters. And so you get to build your network from the time you're a student. I didn't join HFES until after I had graduated because I didn't really know much about it as a student. But that's a great way to get started. And I would say, look at what's interesting to you. I mean, there are standards committees if you want to write standards. There are educational opportunities. There's more policy-based things like accreditation. So some human factors programs are accredited. There's a process to get accredited. So that means there has to be a committee that evaluates those proposals. So yes, you can go to the meeting, you can give talks, you can try to meet people, but there are lots of other ways to get involved. And I would just say, look at the chart and just say what's of interest. And if you don't know, talk to someone who's in the society and say, I'm interested in getting involved. What are things that you know about? And then just explore from there. We're always happy to have volunteers.
Where is this society across all of North America, or is it like continent wide?
I'll answer that in two ways. HFES is technically an international organization, but I would say the bulk of the members are in the US. And there is a Canadian association. There's also the International Ergonomic Association, which doesn't have direct members. If you belong to a federated society, then you're automatically part of IEA. So HFES is part of the International Ergonomics Association, which is truly international. So it's composed, Australia, India, et cetera, many, countries have organizations. So we were founded in the US, and I would say that the majority of the members are still from the US, but we do have international members.
Nice, thank you. And the reason I asked that was just because I was wondering where the conferences would be held each year. Like, do you get to travel new places? And That sounds
The
fun.
conference does move. It's somewhat constrained. We try to find places that are interesting places to go, but which are cheap. Finding those intersections is difficult. So yes, it has been fun. I've been to a lot of places to attend the conference, but they are all held in the US.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to finish off, do you have any advice for those considering pursuing human factors or who are just starting off in the field?
I'm a broken record about networking, and I think that you will get a lot of advice by networking. So rather than me giving some single piece of advice about something that would be good, there's so many ways to find out about what we do and the different areas we work in and that sort of thing. So I would say go to the conference if you can afford to. And before the conference, if you're working in a particular area, let's say you're working in aviation, look and see who's speaking at the conference and say, oh, that's somebody who's been working in that area. And they're doing work that's not that far from mine. If you reach out to them by email before the conference and say, hey, could you spare 30 minutes to chat with me? Most people will do it. I've chatted with lots of people over the years, and it will grow your network and it will, connect you. I think the worst thing about any first conference is you walk in and you think that everybody else knows each other already. And it's not the case. I look around the room sometime and I think, oh, I used to know like 80% of the people and now I know maybe 20. Because people turn over and I'm not meeting as many of the newer folks as I should be, because I tend to gravitate to the people that I came in with. And, you get your kind of local network. So grow your network, use those opportunities. And if there's a company you think you might like to work for, use the directory and say, well, who's a member who works at that company, and call them up for an informational interview. Just say, I'm not really looking for a job right now. I'm just trying to figure out my path, and I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about what you do and how one might get in if one were interested, and that sort of thing. And most people will do an informational interview with you, and it will grow your network.
All right. Well, that's about everything that we had for you today. So thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. We definitely learned a lot, and yeah, we're very happy that you could join us today.
Well, thanks for asking me. It's been great.